I was sitting at my kitchen table in my modest three-bedroom house in suburban Denver when the certified letter arrived that would turn my entire world upside down. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, official and menacing, with the return address of a law firm I had never heard of. Inside, crisp legal documents claimed that my deceased grandmother's $850,000 inheritance legally belonged to my estranged mother, Sandra. The letter demanded immediate transfer of all funds within 72 hours, or I would face criminal prosecution for theft. My hands trembled as I read the threatening language, realizing my own mother was trying to steal the only financial security I had ever known using what appeared to be legitimate legal pressure. The shock of that letter hit me like a bucket of ice water poured over my head on a freezing morning. I immediately grabbed my phone and dialed the number listed for Martinez Rodriguez and Associates, the law firm, supposedly representing Sandra. The phone rang once before connecting to an automated message stating the number had been disconnected. My heart started racing as I frantically searched online for any trace of this legal practice. After 20 minutes of intensive searching through legal directories and Colorado Bar Association listings, the truth became crystal clear: no such firm existed anywhere in the state. My next call went to Margaret Thornton, the actual estate attorney who had handled my grandmother, Clara's will. Margaret's reassuring voice confirmed what I already suspected deep down. Sandra had absolutely no legal claim to any portion of the inheritance. My grandmother had been very specific in her final wishes, leaving everything to me after Sandra had abandoned our family when I was just 12 years old. But Sandra wasn't finished with her opening move. Within hours of my discovery about the fake law firm, my phone started ringing constantly. Each call brought a new wave of verbal assault from the woman who had given birth to me, but had never truly been a mother. Her voice crackled with rage as she screamed about family loyalty and threatened to destroy my life if I didn't hand over what she claimed was rightfully hers. The harassment quickly escalated beyond phone calls. Sandra appeared at my workplace the next morning, creating a scene that made my colleagues stop and stare. She positioned herself right outside the entrance to the software development company where I worked as a programmer, shouting to anyone who would listen that I was a criminal who had stolen money from his dying grandmother. Her voice carried across the parking lot as she described me as a heartless grandson who had manipulated a sick elderly woman. My boss Thomas pulled me aside during lunch break with genuine concern etched across his face. He explained that while he didn't believe Sandra's accusations, the company couldn't have this kind of family drama disrupting the workplace environment. Other employees were becoming uncomfortable, and clients were starting to ask questions about the commotion outside. Sandra's campaign of intimidation expanded to my neighborhood within days. She spent an entire afternoon going door to door, leaving handwritten notes for my neighbors that painted me as a criminal who steals from elderly relatives. The notes contained detailed lies about how I had supposedly isolated my grandmother from her family and coerced her into changing her will. Several neighbors approached me with confused expressions, unsure what to believe about these shocking allegations. The emotional weight of these constant attacks began wearing me down in ways I hadn't anticipated. Sleep became elusive, as I found myself lying awake at night wondering what Sandra would try next. My appetite disappeared, and I started losing weight from the stress of her relentless assault on my character and peace of mind. But the worst was yet to come. On Thursday evening, I pulled into my driveway after another exhausting day of dealing with Sandra's harassment campaign. There she stood next to my front door, accompanied by two men wearing dark suits and official-looking badges. Sandra's face wore a triumphant expression as she gestured toward the men and announced they were federal marshals with a seizure warrant for my property. The taller marshal stepped forward and introduced himself with authority that made my blood run cold. He claimed they had legal documentation proving the inheritance money had been obtained through elder abuse and fraud. His partner produced what appeared to be an official warrant demanding immediate access to all my financial records. They threatened to place me under arrest if I didn't comply with their investigation immediately. My hands shook uncontrollably as I stared at these supposed federal agents. Something about this situation felt wrong, but the badges looked real, and their authoritative demeanor made me question my own instincts. Sandra stood behind them with a satisfied smirk, clearly enjoying watching me squirm under this new level of pressure. Despite my fear, years of working in technology had taught me to pay attention to details that others might miss. As I examined the badges more closely, I noticed the edges looked rough, like they had been cut with scissors, rather than professionally manufactured. The federal vehicle they claimed to be driving was actually a pickup truck with magnetic signs that appeared hastily applied and slightly crooked. My suspicions grew stronger as I observed their behavior. Real federal agents would have presented proper identification and followed specific protocols. These men seemed nervous and kept looking to Sandra for guidance, which struck me as highly unusual for law enforcement officers conducting an official investigation. I made a decision that would change everything. Pulling out my phone, I dialed 911 and calmly explained that I needed police assistance to verify the credentials of supposed federal agents on my property. The fake marshals immediately became agitated, exchanging worried glances as they realized their deception was about to be exposed. When the patrol car arrived 8 minutes later, the two imposters fled without another word, running toward their pickup truck and speeding away. Sandra remained behind, screaming curses at me that could be heard throughout the entire neighborhood. Her mask of false righteousness had completely slipped, revealing the desperate and angry woman underneath. Sergeant Williams stepped out of the patrol car and listened patiently as I explained the entire situation. He took detailed notes about the fake legal documents, the harassment campaign, and the impersonation of federal officers. While he explained that most of Sandra's behavior constituted civil harassment rather than criminal activity, he strongly advised me to document everything and consider legal action to protect myself. Sandra's retaliation came swiftly and viciously. The next morning, real detectives appeared at my office with serious expressions and official badges that looked nothing like the crude fakes from the previous day. Detective Davis and Detective Park explained that multiple police reports had been filed, claiming I had made terroristic threats against Sandra's life. According to these reports, I had allegedly called her repeatedly with detailed plans to harm her. The interview room at the police station felt cold and institutional as I sat across from these two experienced investigators. They questioned me for over an hour about my relationship with Sandra and the specific threats she claimed I had made. My heart pounded as I realized how serious these false accusations could become if not properly addressed. Fortunately, I had learned to document everything after Margaret Thornton's advice about protecting myself legally. I provided the detectives with complete phone records, proving that Sandra had called me dozens of times, while I had not placed a single call to her number. The evidence clearly showed the pattern of harassment flowing in the opposite direction from what Sandra had claimed. Detective Davis reviewed the phone records carefully before looking up at me with an expression of understanding. She explained that false police reports were becoming increasingly common in family disputes, and they had seen this exact pattern before. The charges against me were immediately dropped, and they opened an investigation into Sandra's filing of false reports. But Sandra's attacks on my financial security were just beginning. Over the next week, I received alerts from my credit monitoring service that made my stomach drop. Someone had attempted to open multiple credit cards using my personal information, and loan applications for $40,000 had been submitted in my name at 3 different banks. A trip to my local Social Security office revealed the extent of Sandra's identity theft attempts. She had somehow obtained my Social Security number and birth certificate, using them to try accessing my financial accounts and establishing new credit lines. The The clerk explained that family members often have access to personal documents, making them particularly dangerous when they decide to commit identity fraud. The emotional toll of these constant attacks was becoming unbearable. My girlfriend Jessica started expressing genuine fear about Sandra's escalating behavior, suggesting that I needed to take more serious legal action to protect both of us. Her concern was evident in the way she constantly looked over her shoulder and insisted on staying at my house, rather than returning to her own apartment. My coworker Nathan offered practical advice about home security systems after overhearing my phone conversation with a credit monitoring service. He recommended specific cameras and motion sensors that could help document any future harassment or threats. The conversation made me realize how much my personal crisis was affecting my professional relationships and work performance. I spent an entire weekend installing basic security equipment around my house. Cameras were positioned to cover all entrances and motion sensors were placed along the perimeter of my property. The process felt surreal, knowing that I was protecting myself from the woman who had given birth to me. Just when I thought Sandra's deception couldn't become more elaborate, I received what appeared to be an official court summons delivered by a process server. The document claimed that Sandra was suing me for $2.3 million in damages, alleging that I had emotionally abused and financially exploited my grandmother before her death. The summons listed witnesses I had never heard of and scheduled a court hearing for the following week. The courthouse address on the summons was real, which initially made me believe this might be a legitimate legal proceeding. However, when I called the court clerk to verify the case number, I discovered that no such lawsuit had ever been filed. The summons was completely fraudulent, but it looked professionally printed and contained official-sounding legal language that would fool most people. This revelation hit me like a physical blow. Sandra wasn't just harassing me or attempting identity theft anymore. She was creating an entire fictional legal reality designed to terrorize me into surrendering my inheritance. The sophistication of her deception suggested she had help from people with experience in document forgery and legal intimidation. Despite knowing the lawsuit was completely fabricated, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I would appear at the designated courthouse location to gather evidence of Sandra's fraud and document her criminal behavior. This bold move would either expose her deception or provide me with the proof needed to stop her harassment campaign permanently. I arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early and immediately noticed something strange. Instead of being directed to a courtroom, I was led to a rented conference room in the building's commercial section. Sandra sat at a long table with 3 people she introduced as her legal team, all wearing business attire that looked like it had been purchased specifically for this performance. The man presiding over this fake proceeding wore a black robe that appeared to be a cheap costume purchased online. He introduced himself as Judge Harrison, but his nervous demeanor and constant glances at notes suggested he was reading from a script. Later investigation would reveal he was actually Sandra's boyfriend Marcus, who worked as a car mechanic and had no legal training whatsoever. Sandra's supposed witnesses took turns presenting testimony that would have been laughable if the situation weren't so serious. Her neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, claimed she had witnessed me stealing medication from my grandmother's house, providing specific dates and times that could be easily disproven. 2 young people who appeared to be college-aged actors read from prepared statements describing my alleged emotional abuse of a woman they had clearly never met. The fabricated evidence Sandra presented was remarkably detailed and extensive. She had created fake bank statements showing large withdrawals from my grandmother's account, supposedly proving financial exploitation. Medical records that looked official but contained impossible dates and treatments were submitted as evidence of my grandmother's declining mental state. The effort required to create these documents must have cost Sandra considerable time and money. Throughout this surreal proceeding, I secretly recorded everything on my phone, being careful to capture both the audio and video of each fraudulent claim. The fake judge's lack of legal knowledge became obvious, as he mispronounced basic legal terms and failed to follow even the most elementary courtroom procedures. After 2 hours of this elaborate charade, Judge Harrison delivered his predetermined ruling. He declared that I owed Sandra the full $850,000 inheritance, plus court costs and attorney fees. The fake legal team produced seizure orders that looked convincingly official, demanding immediate payment and threatening to confiscate my house and bank accounts. I played my part perfectly, pretending to be intimidated and overwhelmed by this fraudulent legal proceeding. I requested 24 hours to gather the funds, knowing this would give me time to present my evidence to real law enforcement. Sandra's face lit up with victory as she believed her elaborate scheme had finally succeeded. But as I was leaving this fake trial, Sandra pulled me aside for a private conversation that revealed the true desperation behind her actions. Her confident facade cracked as she explained that she owed $95,000 to dangerous people in Las Vegas from gambling debts. These creditors had given her only 2 weeks to pay before they would collect permanently, and she needed my inheritance to save her life. For a brief moment, I almost felt sympathy for the woman who had tormented me for weeks. She begged me to give her the money, promising to pay me back once she got her life straightened out. Her tears seemed genuine as she described the threats she had received and the fear she lived with every day. But when I refused to hand over my grandmother's legacy to pay for Sandra's gambling addiction, her desperation transformed into pure malice. The mask of motherly concern fell away completely as she hissed that if she couldn't have the money, she would make sure I couldn't enjoy it either. The threat in her voice was unmistakable and terrifying. That afternoon, I drove straight to the FBI field office and met with Agent Patricia Morgan, who specialized in financial crimes and identity theft. Agent Morgan reviewed my recordings of the fake trial with growing amazement, explaining that this level of sophisticated fraud was rarely seen in family disputes. She immediately opened a federal investigation into wire fraud, identity theft, and impersonation of government officials. The evidence I had gathered was more comprehensive than Agent Morgan had expected. The recordings clearly showed conspiracy to commit fraud, and the fake court documents could be traced back to their sources. She explained that Sandra and her accomplices were facing serious federal charges that could result in decades in prison. But Agent Morgan also warned me that Sandra's desperation made her particularly dangerous. People facing financial ruin and criminal prosecution often became unpredictable and violent. She recommended additional security measures and suggested I consider staying elsewhere temporarily while the investigation proceeded. That evening, as I reviewed the day's events, I realized that Sandra's elaborate deception had actually provided me with the evidence needed to end her harassment permanently. Her greed and desperation had led her to commit federal crimes that would be impossible to deny or explain away. The fake trial that was supposed to intimidate me into submission had instead become the documentation of her criminal behavior. I returned home from the FBI office feeling cautiously optimistic that Sandra's reign of terror was finally coming to an end. The federal investigation would take time, but Agent Morgan had assured me that the evidence was overwhelming. I looked forward to my first peaceful evening in weeks, planning to order pizza and catch up on work I had neglected during this crisis. But as I turned into my driveway, my blood turned to ice. My front door hung open at an unnatural angle, clearly kicked in with tremendous force. The security system was beeping frantically, indicating multiple breaches throughout the house. My sanctuary had been violated in the most intimate way possible. The interior of my house looked like a tornado had torn through every room. Furniture was overturned, drawers were pulled out and emptied onto the floor, and papers were scattered everywhere. My laptop containing all my financial information was missing from my home office, along with important documents I had stored in my desk. The violation felt more personal than simple theft. I called the police immediately, and Detective Williams arrived within 20 minutes along with a forensics team. They dusted every surface for fingerprints while I walked through the house, cataloging what had been stolen. Sandra's fingerprints were found on multiple surfaces throughout the house, providing clear evidence of her breaking and entering. The theft went beyond valuable electronics and documents. Sandra had taken family photographs that couldn't be replaced, including pictures of my grandmother and me from my childhood. She had also stolen my grandmother's jewelry pieces that held deep sentimental value and were the only physical reminders I had of the woman who raised me. The cruelty of taking these irreplaceable items felt more devastating than any monetary loss. My security cameras had captured the entire break-in, and reviewing the footage made my stomach turn. Sandra arrived at 10:30 in the morning with two men I didn't recognize approaching my house with bolt cutters and crowbars, as if they were conducting a legitimate operation. They spent nearly 2 hours inside methodically searching through every possession I owned. The emotional impact of this violation was worse than I had anticipated. Knowing that Sandra had touched everything I owned, had rifled through my most private belongings, made me feel sick and angry in ways I couldn't adequately express. My home no longer felt like a safe refuge from her attacks. Sandra's digital assault began the next day when she posted my personal information across multiple social media platforms. She shared my full name, address, phone number, and workplace, accompanied by detailed accusations claiming I was a predator and thief who had exploited a vulnerable elderly woman. The posts were shared hundreds of times, spreading her lies to thousands of strangers. The identity theft escalated dramatically as well. My bank called to inform me that suspicious activity had triggered security protocols, and all my accounts were temporarily frozen pending investigation. Someone had attempted to access my accounts using stolen personal information, and the bank needed time to verify which transactions were legitimate. Jessica received threatening phone calls at her workplace with Sandra's voice clearly identifiable on the recordings her employer's security system captured. The threats were specific and personal, describing where Jessica lived and worked, and warning her to convince me to pay Sandra what she was owed. Jessica was so frightened that she moved in with her sister across town. The stress was affecting every aspect of my life. I couldn't concentrate at work, knowing that Sandra might appear at any moment to create another scene. Sleep became impossible as I jumped at every sound, wondering if she was outside planning her next attack. My weight continued dropping as anxiety destroyed my appetite. The confrontation I had been dreading finally occurred at my local grocery store on Saturday afternoon. Sandra appeared in the produce section wielding a baseball bat, screaming that I had destroyed her life and stolen her future. Other shoppers fled as she advanced toward me, swinging the bat dangerously close to displays of fresh fruit. Store security intervened before Sandra could strike me, but not before she had terrified dozens of innocent people who were simply trying to buy groceries. The entire incident was captured on the store's security cameras, providing clear evidence of assault with a deadly weapon. Police arrested Sandra immediately, and she was taken to jail, still screaming threats and accusations. Even from her jail cell, Sandra continued her campaign of intimidation. She called me collect repeatedly, and I foolishly accepted one call, hoping she might finally show some remorse for her behavior. Instead, she delivered a chilling message that made my blood freeze. "You think this is over, I know where you sleep, and walls can't protect you forever." That threat convinced me to install a professional security system with 24-hour monitoring. The technician who performed the installation had seen similar situations before and recommended additional measures, including motion sensors, reinforced door frames, and direct connections to local law enforcement. The cost was significant, but my safety was worth any price. Agent Morgan called that evening to update me on the federal investigation's progress. Sandra's gambling debts had led her to associate with dangerous criminals who specialized in intimidation and violence. While Sandra herself might be desperate rather than evil, the people she owed money to had no qualms about using extreme measures to collect what they were owed. As I lay in bed that night, every sound outside made me wonder if Sandra had been released on bail and was preparing her next assault. The security system's gentle beeping provided some comfort, but I knew that truly determined intruders could overcome almost any obstacle. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by nightmares of Sandra's face twisted with rage and desperation. At exactly 3:15 in the morning, every alarm in my house began screaming simultaneously. I jolted awake with adrenaline flooding my system, immediately checking the security system's display to identify which sensors had been triggered. What I saw on the bedroom camera monitor made my heart stop completely. Sandra stood outside my house in the darkness, clearly visible under the motion-activated floodlights. She was pouring gasoline around the foundation of my home while mumbling words I couldn't make out through the camera's audio system. In her other hand, she held a cigarette lighter, and her intent was unmistakably clear. She was planning to burn down my house with me inside, turning her desperate need for money into a murderous plot that would destroy everything my grandmother had worked to provide for me. As I watched this horrifying scene unfold, Sandra lit a cigarette and began walking toward the gasoline-soaked porch with the clear intention of setting my entire world on fire. Terror gripped me as I realized Sandra intended to commit murder for insurance money she would never legally receive. I immediately dialed 911 while simultaneously activating my security system's loudspeaker to warn Sandra that police were already on their way and that every inch of my property was under surveillance. My voice echoed across the neighborhood through the security system's speakers, informing Sandra that her arson attempt was being recorded in high definition and transmitted directly to law enforcement. I told her that firefighters and police would arrive within minutes, and that her actions constituted attempted murder rather than simple property damage. Sandra's reaction was immediate panic, rather than the calculated calm I had expected. She tried to flee but slipped on the gasoline she had poured around my house, falling hard onto the wet pavement. The lit cigarette flew from her hand, landing dangerously close to the gasoline-soaked wooden porch of my home. Without thinking about my own safety, I grabbed the garden hose from my backyard and began dousing the flames before they could spread to the main structure. The smell of gasoline and smoke filled the air as I sprayed water everywhere Sandra had poured accelerant. My hands shook uncontrollably as I realized how close I had come to losing everything. Fire trucks arrived first, followed immediately by police cars and an ambulance. The firefighters quickly extinguished the remaining flames and declared the scene safe, though the porch siding showed clear burn damage that would require professional repair. Sandra had managed to escape during the chaos, leaving behind gasoline cans and other evidence of her premeditated arson attempt. Detective Williams arrived and immediately began reviewing the security footage with amazement and disgust. He explained that attempted arson of an occupied dwelling was considered attempted murder under Colorado law, carrying potential life imprisonment sentences. The video evidence was so clear and comprehensive that Sandra's conviction would be virtually guaranteed. A citywide manhunt began immediately, with Sandra's photograph distributed to every law enforcement agency in the region. Her boyfriend's apartment was placed under surveillance, and alerts were issued to airports and bus stations. Detective Williams assured me that someone as desperate and unstable as Sandra would be located quickly. Sandra was found 12 hours later hiding in Marcus's apartment, surrounded by camping gear and additional gasoline cans that suggested she had planned multiple arson attacks. The search warrant revealed detailed maps of my neighborhood with escape routes marked, indicating this wasn't a spontaneous act of desperation, but a carefully planned assault. The evidence seized from the apartment was overwhelming and disturbing. Sandra had compiled extensive information about my daily routines, work schedule, and usual whereabouts. She had photographed my house from multiple angles and researched the response times of local emergency services. Her notebook contained calculations about insurance payouts and detailed plans for accessing the money after my death. FBI agent Morgan arrived at the scene and immediately expanded the federal investigation. Sandra's apartment contained forged documents for dozens of other inheritance fraud schemes, targeting recently bereaved families across multiple states. She wasn't just desperate about gambling debts. She was part of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that specialized in exploiting grieving relatives. The scope of Sandra's criminal activity was staggering. Police discovered that she owed money to organized crime figures in Nevada, California, and Texas, not just Las Vegas. Her debts totaled over $300,000, far more than my inheritance could have covered. The attempted arson was never really about paying off gambling debts. It was about eliminating witnesses to her crimes. As Sandra sat in federal custody facing charges of attempted murder, wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy, I finally began to understand the true scope of danger I had been living under. Agent Morgan explained that Sandra's criminal associates were dangerous people who might still view me as a target if they believed I could testify against their organization. The FBI's investigation revealed that Sandra had been recruited by the inheritance fraud ring specifically because her insider knowledge of my financial situation made me an ideal target. She knew about my grandmother's death, the amount of the inheritance, and my personal habits that would make the fraud more believable. Her family connection provided credibility that strangers couldn't achieve. My workplace had become genuinely concerned about my safety and offered additional security measures, including a temporary office relocation and professional counseling services. Thomas, my boss, explained that the company had dealt with employee safety threats before and had protocols in place to protect their workers from domestic violence situations. Jessica returned to stay with me, now that Sandra was in custody, but both of us struggled with the trauma of nearly losing our lives to such senseless violence. The burn damage to my house served as a constant reminder of how close we had come to disaster. Professional counseling became necessary for both of us to process the emotional impact of Sandra's attacks. The community response was overwhelmingly supportive once neighbors learned the full truth about Sandra's behavior. Many residents had witnessed her strange activities, but hadn't realized the danger she represented. Several neighbors offered to testify about her harassment and erratic conduct during the previous weeks. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. While Sandra remained in federal custody, Agent Morgan called with information that would change my understanding of this entire nightmare. Sandra hadn't been working alone, and the inheritance fraud ring she was part of operated across 7 states with sophisticated methods for targeting vulnerable families. Agent Morgan explained that the fake lawyers, marshals, and trial participants were all part of an organized criminal enterprise that had stolen over $4.2 million from grieving families during the past 3 years. Sandra was just one recruiter in a network that specialized in identifying recently bereaved individuals who had received substantial inheritances. The FBI needed my cooperation to conduct a sting operation that would capture the ring's leadership and shut down their operation permanently. They wanted me to participate in a staged meeting with the criminal organization's mastermind, wearing recording devices to gather evidence of their methods and identify other victims. This request terrified me, but I realized that other families were suffering the same trauma Sandra had put me through. My grandmother had always taught me to help others when I had the ability to make a difference. Participating in this dangerous operation would honor her memory while potentially saving dozens of other inheritance recipients from similar attacks. The decision to help the FBI capture the inheritance fraud ring's leaders wasn't easy, but I knew that staying silent would allow them to continue destroying other families. Agent Morgan spent hours explaining the safety protocols and backup procedures that would protect me during the sting operation. My grandmother had always taught me that courage meant doing the right thing even when it was frightening. The staged meeting was arranged for the following Thursday at a downtown hotel conference room. I would be wearing multiple recording devices hidden in my clothing, and FBI agents would be positioned throughout the building to intervene immediately if the situation became dangerous. Agent Morgan assured me that the criminal organization viewed me as a potential business partner rather than a threat. Vincent Torres arrived at the meeting exactly on schedule, accompanied by two associates who looked like they had stepped out of a crime movie. Torres was a well-dressed man in his 50s who spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating vulnerable people. His entire demeanor suggested sophisticated criminal experience rather than opportunistic fraud. The recording devices captured every word as Torres bragged about their organization's success in stealing from grieving families across the western United States. He described their methods in detail, explaining how they identified targets through obituaries and property records, then researched family dynamics to find the most vulnerable inheritance recipients. Torres revealed that they had perfected a system of psychological manipulation that combined fake legal pressure with emotional exploitation. He laughed while describing how easily most people could be convinced to hand over money when confronted with official-looking documents and authoritative personas. Their success rate was over 70% among targeted families. The criminal organization's sophistication was truly staggering. They employed former actors to play various roles, rented office spaces for fake legal proceedings, and had connections with document forgers who could create convincing replicas of government paperwork. Torres estimated their total profits at over $4.2 million during just 3 years of operation. But Torres made a crucial mistake during our conversation. He revealed the locations where they stored stolen documents, money, and other evidence from their victims. He also mentioned specific names of other inheritance fraud rings operating in different regions, providing the FBI with intelligence that would lead to multiple criminal investigations. As our meeting continued, Torres offered to make me a partner in their operation, suggesting that my experience with Sandra's case made me valuable for recruiting future targets. He described how much money I could earn by helping them identify and manipulate other inheritance recipients who had recently lost family members. The FBI raid began precisely at 4:30 in the afternoon, with federal agents simultaneously hitting the hotel conference room and the criminal organization's storage facilities across 3 states. Torres and his associates were arrested before they could destroy evidence or warn other members of their network. Sandra's cooperation with federal investigators had been extensive, but not because she felt genuine remorse for her actions. She provided information about the criminal organization, hoping to reduce her own prison sentence, revealing details about their methods, victims, and financial operations that proved invaluable to the investigation. The federal trial began 6 months later, and I testified about Sandra's harassment campaign and the elaborate fake legal proceedings she had organized. My security footage and audio recordings provided compelling evidence that helped jurors understand the psychological impact these crimes had on victims and their families. During the trial, I learned that Sandra's gambling debts had been largely fabricated to gain my sympathy and justify her actions. She actually wanted the inheritance money to fund plastic surgery and an expensive lifestyle in another state. Her claims about dangerous creditors were partially true, but the threats came from her criminal associates rather than gambling debts. Other victims from across the country attended the trial, and many of them approached me to share their own experiences with inheritance fraud. Hearing their stories made me realize how common these crimes had become, and how desperately families needed better protection from financial predators who exploit grief and confusion. The prosecution presented evidence that the inheritance fraud ring had targeted over 200 families, successfully stealing money from more than half of their intended victims. The psychological damage extended far beyond financial losses, destroying family relationships and leaving survivors with lasting trauma from betrayal by trusted relatives. Vincent Torres received a 20-year federal prison sentence, while his associates received terms ranging from 12 to 15 years. The judge specifically noted the cruelty of exploiting grieving families and the sophisticated nature of their criminal enterprise when imposing these substantial sentences. Sandra's sentencing hearing provided me with an opportunity to address her directly for the first time since her arrest. I spoke about the emotional damage her actions had caused and the fear I continued to experience even with her in custody. Her response revealed the depth of her selfishness and lack of genuine remorse. Sandra claimed during her final statement that she had only wanted what was rightfully hers as family, attempting to portray herself as a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of an elaborate criminal conspiracy. She showed no acknowledgement of the pain she had caused or recognition of how her actions had nearly resulted in my death. But Judge Harrison had done her research before sentencing. She revealed information that stunned everyone in the courtroom, including me. Sandra had actually received a $50,000 inheritance from her own mother, my grandmother, several years earlier. She had spent that money on gambling, luxury purchases, and plastic surgery rather than anything constructive. This revelation meant that Sandra had already received her fair share of family wealth, but had wasted it through poor decisions and irresponsible behavior. Her entire campaign against me was based purely on greed, rather than any legitimate family grievance. She had no legal or moral claim to my inheritance and knew it from the very beginning. Judge Harrison sentenced Sandra to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. The sentence included restitution requirements for all her victims and a permanent restraining order prohibiting any contact with me. Sandra would be nearly 60 years old before she could return to society. The conviction of the inheritance fraud ring led to the recovery of substantial funds for victims across multiple states. The FBI returned over $800,000 to families who had been defrauded, though the emotional damage could never be fully repaired. Many victims expressed gratitude for my cooperation in bringing these criminals to justice. 6 months after Sandra's sentencing, I stood in my completely renovated home, finally feeling genuinely safe and at peace for the first time since this nightmare began. The burn damage from her arson attempt had been repaired and improved with fire-resistant materials, and my security system now included a professionally designed safe room that could protect against almost any threat. The house felt like home again, rather than a crime scene. Jessica and I had worked together to redecorate and rearrange the furniture, creating new memories to replace the trauma of Sandra's violation. We had married in a small ceremony attended by many of the inheritance fraud survivors we had met during the trial, creating a chosen family of people who understood what we had endured. My volunteer work with elder abuse prevention organizations had become a passion that gave deeper meaning to the trauma I had survived. Working with other families who faced similar predators helped me transform my victimization into advocacy that could protect vulnerable people from financial exploitation. Every family I helped felt like honoring my grandmother's memory. The scholarship fund I established in my grandmother's name had already helped 12 nursing students complete their education. Clara had worked double shifts as a nurse to provide for our family, and supporting future nurses felt like the perfect way to continue her legacy of caring for others. The fund would grow larger each year as my career progressed. Agent Morgan had become a genuine friend rather than just a professional contact. She frequently called to update me about other inheritance fraud cases and to request my assistance in training new agents about these sophisticated scams. Her respect for my courage during the investigation meant more to me than any formal recognition. Speaking at conferences about inheritance fraud prevention had become a regular part of my life. Audiences of attorneys, financial planners, and family counselors learned about the warning signs of these sophisticated schemes and how to protect their clients from similar exploitation. Education was proving to be the most effective weapon against these criminals. The legal fund I had established helped victims who couldn't afford attorneys to pursue justice against their fraudulent relatives. Many inheritance fraud cases never reached prosecution because victims lacked the resources to fight back effectively. My fund had already helped recover over $200,000 for families who would otherwise have no recourse. My relationship with Jessica had grown stronger through the trauma we had survived together. She understood the importance of my advocacy work and supported my efforts to help other families avoid similar experiences. We had learned that surviving betrayal together could create a deeper bond than couples who never faced serious challenges. Professional therapy had been essential for processing the complex emotions surrounding Sandra's betrayal. Dr. Amanda Foster helped me understand that protecting myself from manipulation wasn't selfish, but necessary for maintaining the emotional strength needed to help others. Healthy boundaries actually increased my capacity for genuine compassion. The inheritance fraud ring's conviction had led to expanded federal legislation that increased penalties for crimes targeting grieving families. My testimony before congressional committees helped lawmakers understand how these sophisticated schemes operated and why stronger protections were needed for vulnerable inheritance recipients. Recovery of funds for other victims continued as investigators traced the criminal organization's financial networks. The final total exceeded $1.2 million returned to families across 7 states. While money couldn't repair all the emotional damage, it provided practical help for people whose financial security had been destroyed. My work success had actually improved as a result of the skills I developed during this crisis. Learning to document evidence, analyze complex situations, and communicate clearly under pressure made me a more valuable employee. Thomas promoted me to senior developer, citing my growth in leadership and problem-solving abilities. The community support that emerged during Sandra's attacks had created lasting friendships with neighbors who had witnessed her erratic behavior. Several people mentioned that my experience had taught them to pay closer attention to signs of domestic violence or family conflict that might require intervention. My trauma had created awareness that could protect others. But the most important realization came through months of reflection about my grandmother's true legacy. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was the foundation for building a life dedicated to integrity service and protecting vulnerable people from predators like Sandra. Clara had provided me with both financial security and moral guidance. Sandra's betrayal had initially devastated me because I had confused biological connection with genuine family loyalty. Learning to distinguish between people who earned trust through their actions versus those who demanded it based on shared genetics had been a painful but necessary education. Blood relationships meant nothing without mutual respect and care. The attempted theft had taught me that protecting myself from manipulation wasn't selfish, but essential for maintaining the emotional strength needed to help others facing similar challenges. Setting healthy boundaries with toxic family members actually increased my capacity for helping people who deserved support and compassion. I realized that my grandmother's greatest gift hadn't been the financial inheritance, but her example of how one person's courage and integrity could create ripples of protection and healing that extended far beyond their individual experience. Clara had shown me that surviving hardship with grace could become a source of strength for helping others. The fraud case had connected me with families across the country who were fighting similar battles against relatives who prioritized money over family bonds. These relationships had become a chosen family of people who understood the unique pain of betrayal by those who should have provided love and protection. My advocacy work continued expanding. As more people learned about inheritance fraud prevention, law enforcement agencies requested training about these sophisticated schemes, and financial institutions implemented new procedures for identifying suspicious activity targeting recently bereaved clients. Education was proving more effective than prosecution for preventing these crimes. The final letter I received made everything worthwhile. A young woman named Sarah wrote to thank me for the advocacy work that had helped solve her own inheritance fraud case. Her uncle had attempted to steal her grandfather's life insurance money using methods similar to Sandra's approach, but Sarah recognized the warning signs from my conference presentations. Sarah's letter explained how my willingness to share my traumatic experience had given her the knowledge and courage to fight back against her uncle's manipulation. She had documented his behavior, contacted the FBI, and successfully prosecuted him for attempted fraud. Her grandfather's legacy was protected because someone else had been willing to speak out about similar crimes. Reading Sarah's gratitude made me understand that my grandmother's inheritance had become something far more valuable than financial security. It had become the foundation for a life dedicated to protecting other families from the kind of betrayal Sandra had attempted. Clara's legacy lived on through every person I could help avoid similar trauma. The money my grandmother left me had provided security, but her example of courage and compassion had provided purpose. Sandra's attacks had initially felt like punishment for receiving love I didn't deserve, but I eventually realized they were an opportunity to prove worthy of the trust Clara had placed in me. Now, as I reflect on this entire journey, I understand that surviving Sandra's betrayal wasn't just about protecting myself from a dangerous relative. It was about learning to distinguish between people who deserve trust and those who demanded it, between protecting vulnerability and enabling destruction, between forgiveness and accountability. The inheritance fraud case had taught me that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what was right despite being terrified. My grandmother had lived that principle every day, working double shifts to provide for our family, and standing up to Sandra's manipulation when I was too young to protect myself. Sandra's conviction had brought justice, but more importantly, it had created awareness that could protect other families from similar exploitation. Every person who learned to recognize inheritance fraud warning signs represented another potential victim who could avoid the trauma I had experienced. Have you ever faced betrayal from someone you trusted completely? How did you find the strength to fight back and protect yourself while still maintaining your capacity for helping others? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you or taught you something valuable about recognizing and preventing family financial fraud, please like this video to help it reach other people who might need this information. Subscribe to hear more stories about overcoming family betrayal and building stronger boundaries with toxic relatives. And please share this video with anyone who might be dealing with inheritance disputes or suspicious family members making financial demands. The more people who understand these sophisticated fraud schemes, the fewer families will suffer the kind of trauma Sandra put me through. Thank you for listening to my story and allowing me to honor my grandmother's memory by sharing the lessons her love and sacrifice taught me. I hope that by speaking out about this experience, I can help protect other families from predators who exploit grief and manipulation for personal gain. May you find the courage to protect yourself from those who would harm you and the wisdom to help others who face similar challenges.